G'day guys, welcome to Aussie Azure Tech here. This is your host Kumara. I'm a Microsoft professional with 5 years of experience across Azure DevOps and Azure Cloud. Welcome to a deep dive where we go into Power Apps and all the amazing things that we can do over there. So today we're going to be using Power Apps and integrating managed identities from Entra ID and Azure so that we can start querying the Graph API or other interesting bits from Azure. So let's get on with our prerequisites. So first off, let's create an Azure API management instance in our Azure portal, and we'll go about by actually deploying an bicep file to actually do this deployment for us. This is the same Azure API management bicep file that we have created last week. So I'm just going to go over the basics of what it does. And initially, we have all of our parameters for this file, like the API management service name, the publisher email, the publisher name, and also a tagging object that does all the tagging for us. And we also have the allowed SKUs that are available for our API management service, the default being the developer one. Now let's just run the deployment and create the parameters.json file and then create the custom deployment. Now let's go over the bicep file to create the user managed identity. So just like the previous bicep file, we had the parameters for the user managed identity over here, just the string, the name, and the resource tags. So let's get started on configuring the Azure API management instance. First things first, let's go over to the API section and let's add an API. Let's choose an HTTP trigger and just pop in the display name and the name for the API, followed by the web service URL. And in this case, because we're going to be querying the graph, we're going to be popping in the web service URL as https graph.microsoft.com/version1. And now let's move on to the front end of the API. Let's create a new display name over here, get user profile SAML, just pop in the name, and let's do a simple get request here, followed by the endpoint where we query /user/user UPN. Now the final thing left for us to configure is the authentication, and all we have to do is add this line at the end of the base where we add the authentication of the managed identity resource and the client ID of the user managed identity. Now let's test the API that we just created. So let's just go over to test, pop in our query user UPN over here, and then let's just hit send on the request. And as we can see, we got a 200. That means that we got a successful request. Let's go over some of the key features of Azure API management that we have just configured. The first main thing is the web service URL. This URL is the endpoint that we are trying to forward our requests over from Azure API management. The next thing we configure in Azure API management are operations. In this case, we've configured a get operation for the endpoint /user/user UPN. Let's move over to the authentication. Let's go over to the settings of our Azure API management and then add our user assigned identity as the identity for that instance. Authentication to our Azure API management happens from subscriber keys. Let's go ahead and create a new subscriber key for this. Now let's go ahead and convert our API management into a custom Power Apps connector. Let's just select that the API we are using to create this connector and then provide the Power Platform environment that we are going to be deploying this connector to. Now let's just head over to make.powerapps.co and let's just navigate over to the custom connectors. And as we can see that we have our connector that we just created. Let's click on that and head over to test this operation. And now we can see that everything has been verified, and now we can start using this in our Power Automate and Power Apps flows. Thank you guys, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week for the next episode.